Maybe we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome everybody who has joined so far. And I don't think you need an introduction to Jay, but I will provide one very quickly. Uh, I've known Jay for decades. We leave it at that. And he's one of the most interesting people who's carried the flag of water systems engineering for quite a while now. And anybody who's joining this call who has been in a class with me will know that his papers form some of the basis for the class that I teach for a long time. Uh, but if you think in terms of how we can translate operations research, systems management ideas, systems analysis ideas to the allocation of resources, to the operation of reservoirs, and so forth, we'll have run into Jay's work regularly. He's been doing California water for the longest time. And as I said in the posting on LinkedIn, he is Mr. California Water. He also has an interesting blog that is one of the blogs on water that I read. Um, Given all that history, I was overjoyed when he agreed to come on this particular series, because we are starting this series off this semester, towards the end of the semester, as a matter of fact. And then we'll continue it through the year. And I hope that the people who are joining will join us as we move forward. And I mentioned in the last seminar by Sam Fernald that the plan is to actually convene a group of people who are interested in thinking about the management of the Colorado River or the Columbia River or any of these rivers in the West in terms of principles that could perhaps map in climate variability and change as we understand it today and do it in a way that does not necessarily get overly tied into the history of water allocation in the region. So with that in mind, I think the way Jay has been approaching these things historically is extremely useful as we move forward into these kind of things. And then for today's talk, when I contacted Jay, he was saying, "What do you want me to talk about?" And I was going, "Well, let's say water use." So that's partly responsible for his focusing on this topic today. And perhaps with that, it is good to go ahead and get things started. So Jay, it's all yours.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for the prompt to talk about water use, because I think water use is really the underappreciated driver of almost all water management. And so I'll talk about the rise, fall, and change, not of the Roman Empire or the West, but the Western water use and water management. So let's go on. The water blog you can find at this link here on this page. Next slide, please. There we go. So here's an outline of what I'll talk about. The main theme is that water demands drive water management. Next slide, please. But I want to start off a little bit with a summary of why the West is weird. So why the Western water management is different than Eastern water management. It varies quite a bit across each of the Western states, but here are a few things that I think are in common across all the Western states. First, we have less precipitation with long dry summers. So when I moved here from Seattle on the East Coast, I experienced abrupt climate change. Manu is probably experiencing abrupt climate change coming back from New York. These tremendously long summers. But basically, I tell my students that every year California has a worse drought than the eastern part of the United States has ever seen. And that it's reflected in our institutions, our technologies, our economies, our water management, everything. We also tend to have higher interannual variance in precipitation. So the map here is from Mike Dedinger paper that shows the coefficient of variation for annual precipitation from the East Coast, where I am, where it's very boring, out to California, where it's very exciting, and to Southern California and Arizona, your part of the world, where it's absolutely crazy. So out of this situation has developed, with not much precipitation, very long dry seasons that coincide with the agricultural growing season, and high interannual variability, we have irrigated landscapes and irrigated agriculture. So throughout the West, pretty much 70 to 90% of water use, certainly human water use, is for irrigated agriculture. And, maybe 10% or 20% in some cases is for cities. So move on to the next slide. In California, we also have quite a lot of spatial variability. So we have basically the dark blue area is 20% of the surface area that produces 2/3 of all the runoff in the state. And then the red area is 30% of the surface area that produces 0.1% of all the runoff in the state. And it's over a very large area. So there's a silhouette of Massachusetts for Rich, just so he can see the relative scale of these systems. And so with this huge seasonal and interannual variability and spatial variability, what this has done is made California and the West, I think, as a whole, really a wonderful playground for water engineers. So what we do is we build canals and we modify rivers to move water in space, and we build and operate big reservoirs and groundwater basins to move water in time, both between seasons, but also between years. And the map here on the right, I want you to also focus on how colorful that map is. That it wasn't merely cartographic art. Each of those colors represents a different kind of owner. And so we have a very institutionally rich and complex environment in which we manage these very diverse infrastructures and operate these very diverse infrastructures for some fairly demanding purposes, certainly during drought years and also during flood years. So let's go on to the next slide. So now the main theme of the talk. Water demands drive water management. If there weren't for water demands, why would they pay us to manage it? It's just really very simple. And so that's what's leading us around through history, in the development of the infrastructure, the development of the institutions, the development of the politics, is water demands. And in a place like the West, where water demands are always going to be considerably higher in the colloquial sense, maybe not in the economic sense, than water supplies, that's going to be what's really important. So this makes management expensive and controversial because the demands are pretty high relative to the water availability. We don't, so I said this, we don't manage water without water demands. Nobody will pay us to do it. And so these demands really drive the management and drive the investments, and certainly in the infrastructure and the other things we invest in. Management includes not just people making decisions, it also includes institutions, infrastructure, law, operations that are built on the demands. Again, we wouldn't have any of these things. It's sort of like if a tree falls in a forest and there's nobody around to hear it, it wouldn't make a sound. We only have management because we have demands. Next slide, please. And this is sort of shows how demands for water in California, and I think most of the rest of the West, have changed over time. So back in the 1850s, California had a mining economy. We mined a lot of gold. We didn't have much else, and so employment was based mostly on mining, and we had a very urgent economic need to manage water for mining. So we were originally founded as a riparian state in terms of water law, and we very quickly supplemented that with the appropriative doctrine, and we've been trying to bury that riparian doctrine ever since, with sometimes with success and sometimes not. Most of the other Western states have basically replaced the riparian doctrine, I think, with the appropriative doctrine, but we still maintain some vestigial riparian doctrine. And then as time went on in the 1800s, early 1900s, we had what was mostly an agricultural economy. And in fact, well, I'll get to that later. And then over time, we had the manufacture of goods, and then now we're basically a service economy with really 3 or 4% of the state's economy is agriculture, and essentially almost none of it is mining. And really an amazingly small amount of it is still manufacturing. All of this time, the population has gone up, except for recently, actually, we've sort of peaked out on population. And maybe it's going to slowly increase in the future. Next slide, please. So I wanted to separate this history into different eras of Western water demands, mostly built around California. And so we had the first mining era, where we had tremendous water demands for mining. And then a second era on agriculture, 1860 to 1900s, 1990s. It's still the dominant water demand, water use. Urbanization really beginning in the 1940s in a big way, with manufacturing, and then morphing into a service economy, starting really after the 1970s. And then after the 1990s, really in the 1990s, really adding a new kind of water demand because we're already pretty prosperous, well provided with food and well provided with goods. We started to decide, well, we're rich enough to try to get some of the environment back again. So we have some big increases in environmental water demands. And then the future, where we'll talk a little bit about climate change, where increasing evapotranspiration diminishes our supplies and decreases outdoor water use efficiency. So let's move on. I'll go through the different eras pretty quickly here. Groundwater mining. So really the first 40 years of the state was a mining economy in a lot of ways. So an interesting sort of factoids that I developed from during this period, 1848 to 1880, California produced about 52 million ounces of gold, which is worth about 138 billion. Price. I think it's gone up with the recent macroeconomic moves. And this gold rush and this mining economy really completely transformed our water law, again, as I said, to appropriative doctrine, and started us to build kind of institutions. It took us really 70 years or so to really settle into an appropriative doctrine dominated water law, but it was really it was originally done for mining, although we do it for different reasons today. This 40-year period, this $138 billion is about in that 40 years, that mining economy produced the economic wealth of a little bit less than 3 years worth of today's agricultural economy. So that tells you, gives you a sense for how huge California's economy has grown, and even that huge amount of wealth developed in that 40 years is really pretty small by today's standards, even at today's gold prices. And this $138 billion of gold wealth over 40 years would be about 13 days of California's economy today. And California today has about a $4 trillion per year economy. So it just goes to show you that, boy, that gold was really made us wealthy then, but today it wouldn't make us very wealthy at all. We really have other bases for the economy today. And I think it's very curious, very interesting to note that this ended by the 1880s mostly because of environmental lawsuits. So people like to complain about environmental lawsuits, but essentially the subsequent prosperity, greater prosperity of California's economy and agriculture was partly a result of environmental lawsuits that substantially shut down a lot of the mining in California and certainly in the Sacramento Valley. So I'm not all negative about environmental loss prosperity. Next slide, please. So the court rulings that ended a lot of the mining were basically noted that the mine tailings from this very extensive but diminishingly productive gold mining was interrupting the development of the Sacramento Valley for agriculture, which the courts saw, and I think they're correct, as the next great economic base for the California economy. This agricultural economy that was growing and came to dominate for quite a few years was based, like gold, on a global and national economic demands for these products. Especially after the railroads came in the 1860s or so, there was a market for this agriculture, and we had so we had to figure out how to manage it. Some wonderful history pieces on the migration of Europeans from the eastern part of the United States experienced abrupt climate change when they came to California. They found that they didn't have free distribution of solar desalinated seawater to their crops for free, and they had to actually develop irrigation technology and pay for it and organize it and make it compliant with law and pay for it and all that kind of stuff. So this really drove very vast expansion of both land development and water development, as well as water law, irrigation institutions, technologies, all kinds of stuff. So we had a lot of local irrigation projects early in these days, and then sort of culminating in the expansion of those projects and the development of really interregional projects and interstate projects to move water between regions of California. 90% of Western water use is for irrigated agriculture. Next slide, please. Following that, certainly just before World War II, and I think afterwards, we had an immense population growth. We had tremendous population growth even before then, but I think it really took off around World War II and after that. And this was built around whatever happened in California. We had a lot of manufacturing for a time, but the whole economy was booming, not only in agriculture, but also in manufacturing and some of these other areas of the economy. And this really solidified the development of the really big interregional supplies. The CVP and the State Water Project were both built at this time, and I think this is fairly true for other places as well. And so here is sort of the big urban area of Los Angeles, and the map shows Tulare Lake, which actually partially reformed in the big wet year of 2023. So we had just a little bit of the restoration of Tulare Lake for a little bit until it evaporated and was sucked out by farming. Next slide, please. So when we get to the 1970s, we had a couple of droughts. We had a drought, 1976 to 77, where we found that even though we built most of these big projects, we still had water shortages in the Bay Area. So I don't know if Michael, if you were around the Bay Area at that time.
Yes, yes.
I was only in graduate school in Seattle at the time. Well, I wasn't even there. I was still in high school, and then in studying international relations at the University of Delaware at that time. But I read about it later, and I think that drought in 76, 77 really reoriented certainly the urban water users in the state to understand that just because you had a bunch of water projects doesn't mean you weren't going to have droughts and you weren't going to have water shortages. And experience from that drought, I think, made the urban users in California and many other places, I think, as well, realize that, sometimes it's cheaper to reduce water use than to build huge quantities of supply. So that really introduced a lot of very different thinking in California water. During this period, it wasn't only about water conservation. We still had a lot of growth, and we increased our use of groundwater and use of the Colorado River. And so we really have had, well, since well before this time, but I think after this time at a much greater rate, overdraft of both groundwater and the Colorado River reservoirs. When I look at Colorado River reservoirs, you've got basically, 40 million acre foot of capacities, and we've been mining that just like we would have mined groundwater there since 1980 or so. And so I think this drought, I think in particular 76, 77, started a search in the profession for different supplies and different management, and especially urban water conservation. So again, the growing urban demands at the time were mostly behind a lot of this. And growing interest in the environment as well and water quality, because we had certainly the federal legislation coming in and state legislation along with it. Next slide, please. So we had some more droughts in the late 1980s, early 1990s in California, and I think elsewhere. We'd already started doing urban water conservation, but we started to get more integrated about all these different water management activities. And Metropolitan Water District in Southern California, I think, was really a pioneer in leading what I call the portfolio approach to water management, where you're looking at lots of different ways of managing supplies, lots of different ways of managing demands, both permanently and episodically for droughts. And you're trying to do these in an integrated system so they kind of fit well together. So the water you save under permanent water conservation, you bank it in groundwater for dry years. And so, the whole thing works together as a system, both supplies and demands together. We had diminishing urban growth starting about this period. Before this time, there was a saying in California water plans that it didn't really matter what the water use projections were. No matter how high the projections were, eventually we would surpass them. I think we've outgrown that now. I think we can now see that there is a build-out condition for urban water use, and probably also for agricultural water use. Another important shift at this time in demands is irrigated lands tended to shift to more permanent and high-value crops for global markets. I think something like 70 or 80%, Michael, you might know, of the almonds on the world market come from California.
Yeah.
We have over 1 million acres of almond orchards in California. And boy, that water is valuable, at least when the price of almonds is high. Certainly growing environmental demands, much to the grief of agricultural water users. And then climate change kind of became noticeable. You can see in the hydrologic record effects of a warming climate. Next slide, please. So the future and really today, we see climate change. We see warming. You can see it very clearly in the hydrologic record. You can see it in the extreme records. You can see it in the variance of the hydrology. You can see it some in sea level rise. You'll see more of it in all these areas. In the West, I think more than elsewhere, you can see the increases in evapotranspiration having a lot of effects on maybe LA wildfires and the drought seasons as well. It reduces stream flows, penalizes irrigated agriculture. Some of the irrigated agriculture is saying that their demands are higher because of higher ET. And it's going to affect some of the urban landscapes, make it more expensive to irrigate agriculture and more expensive in water using to irrigate urban landscapes. The overdraft that we have of surface water and groundwater, the climate and sort of the environmental deficits, because we still want to keep the environment strong. All together give us very little ability to capture additional surface water. There's not much surface water to capture except in a few places. And then you have to move it at some ungodly expense to where you want it. And this is going to be accommodated by some increases in water supplies in traditional ways and new ways. But really, for all that expense and all that talk we hear on expanding water supplies, we're mostly going to have to adapt to this situation by reducing water demands, water use for agriculture in particular, because it's the predominant water use really in most of the West, as well as in urban irrigation. And water markets and allocations are going to be very key to how successful we are at managing this in the future. Let's go to the next slide, please. So for the present and future, my view is that we're going to see in the West, and maybe even just in California, 2 to 3 million acres of irrigated lands retired. We're going to see more permanent and high value crops because that's more of what's going to be remaining. And we're going to have to develop new rural industries if we want to keep rural settlements going. I was down in Arizona in Yuma in February, and I saw this huge amount of retirees down there. And I thought, well, maybe that's going to be the new economic base for some of these rural communities. It's not going to be growing alfalfa. Maybe it'll be retirement homes in what can be a very picturesque places. Urban use, we're seeing much less urban water use per capita, largely because we're getting rid of irrigated landscapes in urban areas, as well as with much better building codes and plumbing codes. We're having slower population growth, at least in California. I don't think this is true for everywhere in the West, but we certainly are seeing slower population growth in California. And if we lower the housing price, maybe it'll come back. But between reductions in per capita use and slow growth or no growth in urban use, we really have either net small or no water use growth in the urban sector, which is where 95-98% of the economy is. So the health of the states, the health of the economy, the health of almost all the people is really in pretty good shape with all of this water drama that we're going to see. Agriculture is going to have some really big challenges, but it'll still be a sizable part of the economy, certainly in the rural areas, but the least productive parts of it are going to diminish, I think. That's pretty easy to say. And then the environment, boy, we're really toasted on that, because not only are we trying to maintain, certainly in the West, in the California and the Northwest, colder water species in a warmer environment, we're going to have less water to do it. So we're really not even prepared to even discuss how we're going to figure out how to manage for the environment. I think we're at a pretty primitive state right now. At least we've had 100 years, 200 years of pretty good technology development, institutional development, philosophical, technical development for agricultural and urban water use. We know what we're talking about there, but for the environment, and we know what we want for urban and agriculture for the most part, but on the environment, we're really kind of lost in a changing world. Next slide, please. This is one of my favorite slides by Josue Medellin, who's a professor at UC Merced. I think this is true for this is the California data, and maybe it's true for other states in the West. Roughly 85-90% of all the crop revenue in California comes from half the irrigated acreage. So in terms of a large macroeconomic view, certainly at the statewide scale, we can afford to lose a fair bit of agriculture. It tends to be in field crops, grain crops that the West doesn't usually have much of a comparative advantage at. And fortunately, those are some of the least profitable crops. So we actually have a curve that looks kind of like this on the urban side, where half of the water use in urban areas, certainly in California, is for irrigated landscapes, which has much less economic value than the other half of the urban water use. So we're not nearly looking at shutting down big industries. Next slide, please. So the future of Western water management, again, demands drive large management changes. We're going to see major reductions in lower valued agricultural uses, much less groundwater use, and much less irrigated agriculture. We'll see continued growth in the portfolio approach to managing supplies and demands together, with incentives for the different institutions in and around the regions to collaborate. This will be easier. This is easier to do in the urban area, where you have a lot more money and a lot more organization than agriculture, but they'll find some ways to do it too, and I think that's already happening. And then we'll have some new infrastructure. Instead of building new big dams when there's not really the water to supply them, we're going to have some infrastructure like some connectivity in places and groundwater recharge in places and water extraction in places that facilitate more flexible operations between those wet years and the dry years, as well as some trading. Next slide, please. When I say water portfolios, here's what I mean. A whole bunch of different things you can do to supply water, a whole bunch of things you can do to reduce or manage the demands, improve the efficiency of demands in all of the sectors, I think, including the environment that we haven't really begun to figure out yet. And then because these water supply systems in the West are really very far-flung empires, our far-flung water empire for California extends to the Colorado and up to the border with Oregon. We have to have a lot of incentives to keep our very decentralized management working well together. And there's a whole bunch of economic, political, legal, and sort of social informational mechanisms that we use to sort of keep people at least close to the same page in water management. Next slide. Some conclusions. Okay, the last thing. Demands drive management. We're at a point where we really only have marginal new water supplies available to the West, and most of them are expensive. So seawater desalination, pretty much everything that's suggested is becoming pretty expensive. And really only marginally supplies water. It's nothing big. And so the West is going to remain prosperous and growing, but it's going to have less agriculture. Let's go to, I think I have one last slide. Oh, no, next to last slide. So resistance is futile. We can complain about this situation all we want, but here's a list I made for California more than 10 years ago, and pretty much all of these things are true. The Salton Sink is going to be largely restored. We're going to have less agricultural water use, little diminishing urban use, nitrate contamination under most of the agricultural areas, a lot of tighter groundwater management. So for you Star Trek fans, this is a Borg cube. And then truly the last slide is further readings. Next slide. There we go. So these are just some readings. I'll highlight this fun paper that Nicholas Pinter and Peter Moyle and I wrote on California water model resilience through failure, which basically looks back at that interannual variability that we have in California and says, well, that means we see a lot of floods and a lot of droughts. And every time we see a flood or drought, we make some incremental improvement in our flood or our drought management. And so over time, we've had more opportunities to make improvements, and I think that explains probably most of our improvements in California water over a century or so. So that's all I have. How about any questions? I wanted to end after not too long, in order to have more time for questions than what you had last time.
Yeah, no, thanks very much, Jade. I think that was very nice. I'll turn it over to the audience for questions. There's some stuff in chat that's coming up, but let's go with the ones, if you guys want to raise your hand using the hand raising feature for Zoom, or otherwise go right ahead.
So it'll be less efficient if I try to read the questions.
Yeah, I'm reading them. I'll try to see if I
So
can.
if you ask me questions, this will be my qualifying exam.
Okay, so Denise Moreno says, I like your point about mining in California and how environmental lawsuits help change law management practices away from water management for mining. Does California have economically viable mining deposits today? In other words, do you see mining companies interested in developing mines in California due to the rush for metals? I was going to ask that question, Denise. You stole my question.
That's an interesting question, because there's some mining in California, and certainly there's a discussion about increasing mining of some lithium deposits down in the Salton Sea area.
Right.
But mining today is much less labor intensive in a much larger population. So I don't see it coming back as a major economic base for anything more than a few local areas. And in the case of the Salton Sea, that might be an important exception.
We are waiting for another question, Oscar.
I see one here. California water is so political, it's hard to move into the most progressive solutions there. Well, California's water is hard because it's a tough neighborhood. There's a lot of demands, and we've got a lot of people here and a lot of interests here. So it's hard because we've been successful so far. I would put a positive spin on it that way.
Hey, Dr. Lund, this is like a question from the in-person session here. I had a question about where you see the role of Native American tribes playing in like the future of water management in California. Like we were talking about augmenting supplies. Obviously, like one of the other options there is like reallocating water, or like kind of like conservation agreements that Met is working out with tribes and around Yuma. Where do you see those developments going?
As I understand it, and it's been some time since I've looked at it, the potential tribal claims on the Colorado River on the order of 1 or 2 million acre feet, and a system that has a mean annual flow something on the order of 12 million acre feet. So that's pretty sizable, and they would come in as pretty senior water right holders with some national oomph behind them, legal presence behind them. In California, it's much less so. We have 40 million people and maybe a few 100,000 Native Americans and tribes. Not a lot of Native American irrigation projects. It's mostly about salmon in the northern part of the state, and maybe little incidental amounts of water elsewhere. So I don't think it's going to be nearly the driver. Politically, there's always a bit of driving to increase the involvement of Native Americans, because their casinos have given them quite a bit of discretionary wealth to push around politically.
Jay, I have a question for you in case somebody else doesn't. In the West, we have the best conditions for solar energy in the world, in terms of regularly available solar energy and in terms of low variance in that as well. Yet we don't have significant penetration And when I talk to people, the regulatory picture is what they throw at me. It takes too long to get approvals to do large scale solar. So I have two questions related to each other. One is that in Asia, floating solar is exploding. There are large scale solar plants that are being put on reservoirs with capacities up to 2 gigawatts. And we've done some analyses. So in Mead and Powell, if you just cover 10% of the area, you end up with 13 gigawatts of solar capacity compared to compared to 2.4 gigawatts of hydro that's installed there. Yet no one here wants to do that, even though there are evaporation reduction benefits and so forth. So that's sort of the setting. But the other thing is that the argument I hear is that solar is not reliable, renewables are not reliable, so we have to back them up. But it seems that there are potential benefits for water processing, I'm going to say it that way, for both transmission and treatment from very, very cheap electricity that's available when solar is surplus. Do you see a role that could be played by solar in the West in terms of improving the water situation? Or is that just lost because we don't understand what that would mean?
Well, I think we have a pretty good penetration in California of solar. I expect this probably right now, but it's not infrequent that that we have negative energy prices on our grid.
Right.
Because in the middle of the day, we've got all this solar coming in, and it's the spring, and we might have had a wetter year than average. So we have to let that hydropower out of the reservoir. And we can't store it, and so we have negative prices. I don't think we would do a lot of solar on reservoirs in California and much of the West because we use the reservoirs also for recreation.
But you do all these economic and game theory things as well. If you look at the money that would be generated by the solar, it would dwarf the monetary benefits from recreation.
Yeah. So I don't know about that actually.
Interesting. Yeah.
Especially because you have in parts of the Central Valley a lot of overdeveloped agricultural land that you're looking for new uses for.
I see. Yeah.
So one of the and it's at a part of the world. One of the reasons that area is so valuable for cropland is because it's got sunshine all the time.
Yeah.
So I think we're going to see conversion of. It might not be large. It might not be. I don't think it'll be millions, but it might be 100,000 or so acres of land in the Tulare Basin, in particular, to solar farms, and we're seeing a lot of development there. Part of the problem with holding it back a little bit is that you have to build the grid to take that power.
Yeah.
But then we also have to figure out storage so that we can use that at night. But solar has really flipped over the power marketing in the West.
Yeah. Okay. Any more questions from the audience? Okay, I guess we will thank Jay and hope that you guys will join us for the next one as well. And I'll put out information on that on LinkedIn as well. Oh, there you got a question. Is there a source of optimism we can try and latch on to?
Well, I think the optimism is that for most people and most of the economy of California, unless we really screw up royally, we should be okay. Our cities might look a little bit more like the European cities around the Mediterranean that we go visit as tourists, and that they'll be a little less green. And we're going to have less agriculture, but certainly economically, most of the people are not going to be, we're not going to go back to a third world country this way. We do have tremendous challenge on the environment. But we would have that challenge even if we weren't short of water, because the temperatures are really what's killing the ecosystem, not the water. The water is important, but you'd have those problems anyway.
Okay, that's great.
So it's
Any
kind of
other
a glass
questions?
half full, if you want to take, for this professional analogy here.
I'll ask a question.
Sure,
Please.
Rich.
Well, I have a few questions, but I wonder, because you didn't talk about your own work on Calvin, and I know you modeled the whole system, California, in a very integrated way. I'm wondering, like, if you could just summarize, is there some really major lessons that you've learned from all of that work, all the systems and integrated water resource management that you've done over the years using a computer program that you developed?
So that's great question, Rich. Thank you for giving me an excuse to talk about my favorite model. One of the reasons why I feel fairly certain about a lot of my conclusions here is because we've modeled the system and we've kicked it around a lot with climate changes and all, losses of infrastructure and all kinds of things. So the urban economy, if you have anything like a market for water, anything like a reasonable process for moving water around, which we have the infrastructure for, mostly, the most valuable stuff economically gets preserved, and so we can, the most brittle part of the state's water system for California is the delta, and that's also going to be a hard thing to do, but I think if it really breaks, then people will have a lot of motivation to fix it. And there'll be the money in this huge economy, fifth largest economy in the world, and the organization to do it. And it won't be pretty. It won't be smooth, but eventually we do stuff that makes sense. And you can see sort of this in the history of California water, where we make a lot of mistakes, but because we have this high variance, we're always kicking it around. And eventually we come up with something that kind of works, at least for a while, and the demands change and we sort of follow the demands along. So people are really pretty smart for the most part, eventually. We'll see if I still say that in 4 years.
Yeah.
I have some doubts that I didn't have before. Any other questions?
Well, maybe you could just comment on the role of desalination and also infiltration-based techniques for controlling floods. Those are two things I know that a lot is happening in California, or I've heard about it, but I didn't hear you say much about either of those.
Let me do desalination first. I think we will see a small part of California urban water use from desalination. It's very, very expensive. Israel uses a lot of desalination because they don't really have much alternative for a large economy, a large population. In California, we have other alternatives for the most part, and we have a lot of irrigated agriculture. So the irrigated agriculture in Israel is mostly using wastewater from the larger urban water use. Here in the West, it's reversed. We have a lot of agricultural water use and much less urban. So it's, for most urban uses, it's far cheaper to buy water from agriculture than to do desalination. There's some prospects for improving the cost of some of that desalination, either by desalinating brackish water or using deep sea desalination. I was talking with a friend today about that, but I don't think it's going to be more than 10% of all of our urban water use. On the infiltration, filling up groundwater basins, we don't have enough precipitation frequently enough to catch it. We can't catch it all when it comes, and it doesn't come all that frequently in large amounts. So there's some places where we'll make some really important improvements, but compared to our, at least in California's groundwater overdraft rate is about 2 million acre feet per year. If we get 200,000 or 300,000 acre feet per year of new supplies by infiltrating stormwater, I'll be impressed. Not much room to maneuver, unfortunately.
Thanks.
Yeah, I see one of the comments is we can catch more than we think we can. That's
Yeah,
always good. Yeah.
One must remain hopeful, but the people that I've seen by hydrologists that have looked at these numbers are not so promising. It's certainly more than half of this deficit is going to have to be made up for by reducing water use. Unless you think magical amounts of water can move across the delta, which I just don't see that happening.
Any more?
There's another one by Mason above the other one you mentioned.
Oh, I missed that. Okay. Have you simulated all water resources, comprehensive models such as the systems dynamics for this area?
As much as anybody.
More than anybody, probably.
And we put it into an optimization model that has both supply and demand management. And a lot of the things that we talk about, the farmers, which are the ones in the hardest circumstance, would not be willing to pay for. So you got to have people willing to pay for stuff in order to be economically valuable. That's the lesson I learned from Michael Hanneman.
Michael, did you want to add anything?
Thought I'd bait you, Michael.
You know, I think potable reuse is a
Oh,
more
that's a
serious
good thing to
option
raise.
than desal.
Yeah, I agree. We're seeing a lot of interest in Southern California in potable reuse.
Right.
Driven not so much by water scarcity, but by the high cost of discharging wastewater.
Right, and renovating, the high cost of renovating wastewater collection and treatment systems that are 40+ years old
Right.
now.
Right.
Yeah.
So that I think, but again, we talk about that a lot. We're going to spend a lot of money on it, but it's a relatively small amount of water compared to the overall human water use because agriculture is such a big share.
Oh, yeah.
But that's a good topic to raise.
All right. Well, we seem to be hitting time as, oh, there's another question, just when you think. Yeah. What's your response to push for more bigger reservoirs in light of environmental challenges?
I think, California is a big place. The West is a big place. There will be a few places where you can justify bigger reservoirs, occasionally to catch surface water, occasionally to store water that you've conserved while you're trying to infiltrate it into groundwater. So things like that in a systems view. But I don't think it's going to be a lot, and it's pretty expensive. When I've looked at the proposals for expanding surface water reservoirs here, they're really like $2,000 or $3,000 an acre, $2,000 an acre foot, $1,500 an acre foot of delivered water. So again, farmers usually aren't willing to pay for that.
Okay, since people seem to be stimulated by each question, let's give it one more shot.
Okay.
Yeah, looks like we are running out of stimulation here. Do you
I'm pretty
see?
optimistic generally, but except for the environment. The environment is really sad. That's the area where university thinking would probably be the most useful, because the society as a whole it's struggling to even have a decent conversation about realistic conversation about the future.
Yeah. But the environment falls by the wayside in that conversation, right? So,
Well, I mean, something that clearly people value a lot.
yeah,
We're an affluent enough country that we actually do value it quite a bit.
yeah.
And once you've gotten rid of it, whatever comes back, and you have to decide whether you like it or not. So it would behoove us, I think, to have some malice of forethought about what kind of environment we want to have in a warmer climate.
others that I see there. So let's thank Jay, and hope to see more of you, Jay, down the road.
Okay,
And, yeah.
thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay.